The wind was a liar in the Arizona territory. It could whisper promises of a cool evening through the cottonwoods, lulling a man into a false sense of peace, only to turn and shriek like a banshee an hour later, tearing at the land with claws of sand and fury. Amos knew its tricks. He'd lived on this patch of earth long enough to learn that the only thing you could trust was the weight of the soil in your own hand and the ache in your own back. His farm was a testament to stubbornness. A modest cabin built of sturdy pine, a barn that leaned just enough to have character but not enough to fall, and fields that he'd carved out of the unforgiving landscape with sweat and blood. It was a lonely kingdom ruled by the ghosts of what might have been. 2 years had passed since he'd buried Lily, and with her he'd buried the part of himself that knew how to smile. Now life was a series of chores, a rhythm of survival that left little room for thought, and even less for feeling. The silence in the cabin was his constant companion, a presence as solid and unmoving as the stone hearth. That afternoon the sky began to bruise. The usual brilliant blue bled into a sickly purple-gray at the edges. The air grew heavy, thick with an unspoken threat. Amos was securing the latch on the chicken coop when the first gust hit, a physical blow that stole the air from his lungs and threw a fistful of grit in his face. He squinted toward the horizon and saw it coming, a monstrous, rolling wall of red dust, a churning apocalypse that swallowed the sun. A haboob. He'd seen them before, but this one felt different. It felt personal. He made a run for the cabin, the world around him dissolving into a maelstrom of stinging sand and roaring wind. The door slammed shut behind him, and the cabin was plunged into an eerie amber twilight. The wind howled, rattling the window panes in their frames, searching for a way in. For the next hour, Amos sat in his worn armchair, listening to the assault. It was the sound of chaos, the sound of the world being unmade. In the heart of the storm, there was nothing to do but wait, a prisoner in his own home. Then, through the cacophony, he heard it. A sound so out of place it felt like a hallucination, a faint, rhythmic thudding. Asterisk thump, thump, thump. Asterisk, it was the sound of a fist against it. Amos froze, his hand tightening on the arm of the chair. It was impossible. No one could be out in this. Not a soul would be foolish enough to travel, let alone find his isolated farm in the blinding fury of the storm. It had to be a branch or a loose shutter. He waited, holding his breath, listening for it to come again. Thump, 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 dot, asterisk. This time it was more desperate, more urgent. It was unmistakably human. A cold knot of suspicion and reluctance tightened in his gut. Strangers meant trouble. In this part of the country, a knock on the door during a storm could mean a lost traveler, or it could mean something far more dangerous. His rifle was propped against the wall just a few feet away. His first instinct was to grab it, but then he remembered Lily's voice, a soft echo from a better time. Asterisk, every soul deserves a moment's grace, Amos, even the ones we don't understand. Asterisk, with a heavy sigh that was half-grown, he rose and unbolted the door. He had to lean into it, fighting against the force of the wind. When he finally wrenched it open, the storm roared into the cabin, a savage beast of dust and noise. And there, framed in the doorway, was a figure. It was a woman. Her face was caked with a mask of red dust, her dark hair whipped wildly around her shoulders. She was Navajo. He could tell by the cut of her buckskin dress and the determined set of her jaw. But it was her eyes that held him, dark, deep, and filled with a desperate exhaustion that seemed to suck all the energy from the air around them. She was clutching a bundle to her chest, a swaddle of blankets wrapped so tightly it seemed more like a shield than a cradle. She swayed on her feet, on the very edge of collapse, but her grip on the bundle was absolute. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Her entire being was a plea for shelter. Amos's mind raced. He had no dealings with the Navajo from the nearby reservation. He kept to himself and they kept to theirs. An unspoken, uneasy truce held the line between their worlds. To let her in was to invite complications he couldn't begin to fathom, but to leave her out there, that was a death sentence. He saw the specter of Lily shaking her head in disappointment. "Get in," he growled, his voice rough from disuse. He stepped back, holding the door open just wide enough for her to pass. She stumbled inside, nearly falling as she crossed the threshold. Amos slammed the door shut, the bolt sliding home with a final metallic thud that cut them off from the raging world outside. The silence that fell between them was thicker than the dust still swirling in the air. The woman paid him no mind. Her attention was solely on the bundle in her arms. She sank to the floor near the hearth, her back against the warm stones, and began to carefully brush the dust from the blankets. She moved with a slow, deliberate tenderness, as if the package she held contained the last sacred thing in the world. Amos stood by the door, watching her. He was a stranger in his own home. This woman, with her silent intensity, had shattered his solitude. He felt an unwelcome irritation rise in him. He hadn't asked for this. He didn't want this disruption to the carefully ordered emptiness of his life. "There's water in the bucket," he said, gesturing with his chin. "And some stew on the stove if you're hungry." She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement, but didn't look up. Her focus remained on the child. Amos watched, his arms crossed over his chest, as she unwrapped the outer layer of the blankets, revealing the small, still form of a sleeping baby. The child was so tiny, so fragile against the backdrop of the storm's fury. He busied himself by lighting a second lantern, the small acts of normalcy a defense against the strangeness of the situation. The storm raged for another hour before its fury finally began to recede. The howling wind softened to a mournful whistle, and the constant barrage of sand against the glass ceased. As a fragile quiet settled over the land, the baby began to stir. A small, fretful whimper broke the silence in the cabin. The woman tried to soothe the child, rocking it gently, but the whimpering grew into a weak, hungry cry. Amos found himself moving without thinking. He went to the small pen behind the stove where he kept a nanny goat for milk. He filled a small tin cup and warmed it slightly over the fire. He wasn't sure why he was doing it. It was an instinct he thought had died with Lily. He approached the woman cautiously and held out the cup. "For the babe," he mumbled, feeling awkward and out of place. For the first time she looked directly at him. Her dark eyes held a flicker of surprise and perhaps a sliver of gratitude. She took the cup with a steady hand. She dipped her finger into the warm milk and brought it to the baby's lips. The child, driven by a powerful hunger, began to suckle eagerly. Relieved, Amos knelt down, his joints cracking in protest. He intended to get a closer look at the woman, to try and understand who she was and what trouble she had brought to his door. But his gaze fell instead upon the child. The baby, momentarily satisfied, had stopped crying. Its tiny, wrinkled face was calm, and then its eyelids fluttered open. Amos looked down and the world stopped turning. He wasn't looking at the dark eyes of the Navajo woman who held him. He was looking at a pair of eyes the color of a winter sky just before a snowstorm, a startling, piercing blue-gray. They were eyes he knew better than his own reflection in a still pond, better than the calloused lines on his own hands. They were his eyes. The tin cup slipped from her hand, clattering unnoticed onto the floorboards. The air in Amos's lungs turned to ice. Every muscle in his body locked. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. He could only stare into the impossible, undeniable truth looking back at him from the face of a stranger's child. The past he had so carefully buried, the secrets he thought were long forgotten, had just been delivered to his doorstep by a tempest. He was frozen, a statue of a man whose solitary world had just been irrevocably, terrifyingly shattered. The silence in the cabin stretched taut, thin as a wire. It was a silence filled with the impossible blue-gray of the baby's eyes. Amos felt as if the storm had moved inside him, a whirlwind of disbelief and a cold, creeping dread that coiled in his stomach. His gaze flickered from the child to the woman, whose own dark eyes were wide and watchful, as if she were waiting for a verdict to be handed down. "No," Amos breathed, the word a rough, hollow sound. He pushed himself to his feet, backing away until his shoulders hit the rough-hewn pine of the wall. He shook his head, a slow, deliberate motion of denial. "That's not possible." The woman, Autumn Star, did not flinch from his disbelief. She held his gaze, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and unwavering resolve. She adjusted the baby in her arms, her movements calm and certain. "He is your son," she said, her English soft but clear, each word carefully chosen. Amos's mind reeled, grasping for logic, for any explanation other than the one staring him in the face. "I don't know you. I've never seen you before in my life." "You do not know me," she agreed with a slight dip of her head. "But you knew his mother." Spirit Fawn. The name struck Amos like a physical blow. Spirit Fawn. It was a name he hadn't heard, hadn't even allowed himself to think in over 3 years. It belonged to a different lifetime, a different man. A time before the grief, before Lily, before the farm had become a fortress for his sorrow. He remembered a secret warmth by a moonlit creek, whispered words in a language he didn't understand, and the sad, knowing look in her eyes when he'd told her he was to be married. He had thought that chapter of his life was a ghost, faded and buried. But ghosts, he was now learning, had a way of coming back, and this one had brought a child. Spirit Fawn, he repeated, the name tasting like ash and memory on his tongue. "Where is she?" A shadow passed over Autumn Star's face, a deep and profound sadness that seemed to age her in an instant. "She is sick. The coughing sickness has taken her strength. She walks the path to the spirit world." Her voice dropped to a near whisper. "She wanted her son to know his father. To be safe, she made me promise. To bring him to you." The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying certainty. The timeline. It fit. A secret kept for months, then years. A son he never knew existed. He felt a surge of anger at Spirit Fawn for her silence, at this woman for bringing this chaos to his door, and most of all at himself, for a past that refused to stay buried. He was a widower, a man loyal to the memory of his wife. This child was a betrayal of that memory, a living, breathing testament to a life he'd lived before her. He paced the length of the small cabin, his boots thudding a restless rhythm on the floorboards. The baby, sensing the tension, began to fuss again. Autumn Star murmured to him in her own tongue, soft, melodic sounds that seemed to calm him almost instantly. Amos stopped, his back to them, staring out the dusty window at the world washed clean by the storm. The setting sun painted the clouds in hues of orange and rose. It was a beautiful, peaceful scene that felt like a mockery of the tempest inside him. He was trapped. To turn them out now would be to condemn them. But to let them stay, what would that mean for his life, for his reputation in the nearby town of Redemption, a place that thrived on gossip and suspicion? He turned back around, his face set like stone. His heart was a war zone of conflicting duties. The duty to his past with Lily, the duty to his solitude, and a new, terrifying duty that looked at him with his own eyes. "You can stay the night," he said, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. "The loft is empty. There are blankets in the chest." He didn't offer comfort or welcome, only the barest minimum of shelter. It was all he could give. Autumn Star simply nodded, her expression unreadable. She understood. She had delivered her message and fulfilled her promise. The rest was up to him. The next morning, an uneasy truce held within the cabin walls. Amos rose before dawn, his mind a tangled mess of sleepless thoughts. He milked the goat, fed the chickens, and worked in the fields, seeking refuge in the familiar physical labor. But he couldn't escape the two new heartbeats in his house. The soft coos of the baby, the quiet, unobtrusive movements of the woman. She had made a small, clean camp for herself and the child in the loft, and when he returned for breakfast she had a pot of coffee simmering on the stove and had used some of his flour to make flatbread. She didn't speak, merely set a plate on the table for him. They were eating in strained silence when the sound of approaching hoofbeats broke the morning quiet. Amos was instantly on alert. He strode to the door, his hand instinctively resting on the rifle he'd left propped against the frame. A large, heavy-set man on an equally large bay horse was riding into his yard. Cornelius. His closest neighbor, if you could call 5 miles close. Cornelius was a man whose friendliness was as wide as his ranch and just as shallow. He had been trying to buy Amos's land for years, citing the creek that ran through it as essential for his expanding herd. Cornelius swung down from his saddle, a broad, false smile plastered on his face. "Mornin', Amos. Saw the storm kicked up something fierce yesterday. Just wanted to ride over and make sure you weathered it all right." "I'm fine, Cornelius," Amos said, his tone flat, his body blocking the doorway. Cornelius's eyes, small and shrewd, flickered past Amos's shoulder, trying to peer into the dim interior of the cabin. "Smells like you got company. Didn't figure you for the entertaining type these days." Before Amos could answer, Autumn Star appeared behind him, the baby held securely in a cradleboard on her back. She had come to retrieve the water bucket, her movements silent and graceful. Cornelius's smile faltered, replaced by a look of unveiled disdain. His eyes raked over Autumn Star, then settled on the cradleboard. "Well, well, what have we here? It looks like you've taken in a stray." His voice was laced with a condescending venom. "You ought to be careful, Amos. Their kind can bring a whole mess of trouble. And with a pup, too." A hot, protective anger flared in Amos's chest. It was an emotion so foreign he barely recognized it. He hadn't felt anything but grief for 2 years, and now in the span of a day, he'd felt shock, anger, and now this raw, primal urge to stand between this sneering man and the woman and child behind him. They were his problem, not Cornelius's. Amos took a deliberate step forward, forcing Cornelius to take a half step back. His voice was low and dangerous. "What happens under my roof is my business, Cornelius, not yours." Cornelius raised his hands in mock surrender, but his eyes were hard, just looking out for a neighbor. "People in town might get the wrong idea, seeing a squaw shacked up with you, especially after a fine woman like Lily." The mention of Lily's name was a calculated cruelty. It was meant to shame him, to remind him of what he'd lost and what he was now harboring. But instead of shame, it ignited Amos's resolve. This was his land, his home, his life, and these two strangers, for better or worse, were now part of it. "I think you've said your piece," Amos said, his gaze as cold and hard as iron. "You can go now." The false bonhomie vanished completely from Cornelius's face. He saw the unyielding line in Amos's jaw and knew he had pushed too far for now. He gave a curt, ugly laugh. "Have it your way, but don't come crying to me when the reservation comes looking for what's theirs, or when the sheriff decides to pay a visit." He mounted his horse, shot one last venomous look toward Autumn Star, and spurred the animal into a gallop, kicking up dust in the clean morning air. Amos watched him go, the tension slowly draining from his shoulders, leaving a heavy weariness in its place. He turned and looked at Autumn Star. She was standing perfectly still, her face a mask of stoic dignity, but he could see the apprehension in her eyes. The storm outside had passed, but Cornelius had just made it terrifyingly clear that a new, far more dangerous one was just beginning. The days that followed bled into weeks. each one marked by the rising and setting of a relentless Arizona sun. The sharp edges of Amos and Autumn Star's initial encounter began to soften, worn down by the shared, unspoken rhythm of a life that now revolved around the small, helpless being in the cradleboard. An unspoken routine formed between them. Amos would handle the heavy work of the farm, his muscles finding solace in the familiar burn of labor, while Autumn Star managed the quiet world of the cabin, her hands always busy, mending, cooking, and above all, tending to the baby. The child was the bridge between their two silent worlds. He was a constant, undeniable presence. One afternoon, as Amos was carving a new handle for an axe on the porch, he watched Autumn Star humming a soft, low melody to the fussing baby. The sound was ancient and soothing, a thread of continuity from a world he did not know. The baby, however, was part of his world now. He was blood of his blood. "He needs a name," Amos said, the words coming out rougher than he intended. Autumn Star looked up, her humming ceasing. She waited, her dark eyes patient. Amos cleared his throat, feeling a strange nervousness. He'd never named a child. He and Lily had talked of it, of course, in hushed, hopeful whispers late at night. The name they'd chosen had been for a child of their shared future, not one from a buried past. He couldn't use that name. This boy deserved his own. "Daniel," he said, testing the sound of it. "His name is Daniel." A small, almost imperceptible smile touched Autumn Star's lips. "Daniel," she repeated softly, looking down at the baby. "It is a strong name." The act of naming him was a turning point. It was an acceptance, a claim. Daniel, his son. The thought no longer sent a jolt of panic through him, but a strange, deep resonance, like a bell rung in an empty hall. He found himself watching the boy for hours, marveling at the tiny, perfect fists, the shock of dark hair, and the way those impossible blue-gray eyes would lock onto his own, as if in recognition. A fierce, protective instinct, an emotion he thought had been buried with Lily, was taking root and growing in the barren soil of his heart. The silence between Amos and Autumn Star began to fill with words. They were hesitant at first, small offerings of information exchanged over the dinner table. He asked about her people, the dying, and she spoke of a life guided by the seasons, of respect for the land, and of traditions that stretched back longer than the white man's maps. She told him more about Spirit Fawn, not of their shared secret, but of her friend's kindness, her laughter, and the courage it took for her to send her only child away to a man she hadn't seen in years. In return, Amos found himself speaking of Lily. He hadn't said her name aloud to another living soul since the day he'd filled her grave, but with Autumn Star it felt different. She listened without judgment, her gaze steady and compassionate. As he spoke of Lily's gentleness, her love for the wildflowers that grew by the creek, and the crushing emptiness she had left behind, he was not betraying Lily's memory by speaking of her, he was honoring it. And in the telling, he felt a small, tight knot of grief within him begin to loosen. He began to see Autumn Star not as an intruder or a reminder of his past mistakes, but as the woman she was, strong, wise, and possessed of a quiet grace that seemed to calm the very air around her. He noticed the deftness of her hands as she stitched a tear in his work shirt, the way she found edible roots and herbs near the creek that he had never known existed, the unwavering patience with which she cared for Daniel. One evening, as she was handing the sleeping baby to him to place in the small cradle he'd built, their hands brushed. A jolt, warm and startling, shot up his arm. He looked up and met her eyes. In their dark depths he saw a reflection of his own surprise, his own dawning awareness. The space between them was no longer empty. It was charged with a new, unspoken feeling. It wasn't the same love he'd had for Lily. That was a chapter closed and cherished. This was something new, something tentative and wild, born not of whispered promises, but of shared hardship and mutual respect. But the fragile peace they were building was not destined to last. Cornelius was a man who watered his grudges like crops, and he had not forgotten the perceived insult at Amos's doorstep. He had been to town, spreading poison, weaving a tale of a grieving widower who had lost his mind, taken up with a squaw, and was harboring a half-breed child of unknown origin. The story found fertile ground in the fearful, prejudiced minds of the townsfolk. The first sign of real trouble came not as a threat, but as a silence. When Amos went to town for supplies, men who had known him for years would suddenly find something interesting to look at across the street. The store owner was curt, his questions clipped. He was an outcast. Quote, the direct attack came a week later. Amos went to the creek that bordered his property, the lifeblood of his farm, and found the water level dangerously low. It was a mere trickle, not enough to water his livestock, let alone his wilting corn crop. A cold dread settled in his stomach. He followed the creek bed upstream, his boots sinking into the damp, exposed mud. A quarter-mile onto Cornelius's property. He found it, a crudely built dam of rocks and logs, diverting the flow of the entire creek into a new channel that led directly to Cornelius's own thirsty fields. It was a declaration of war. Amos stood there for a long time, staring at the obstruction. This wasn't just a petty act of spite. It was a calculated strategic move designed to choke him out, to make his farm untenable, to force him to sell for pennies on the dollar. Cornelius was using Autumn Star and Daniel as the excuse, the moral justification for his greed. He returned to the cabin as dusk was falling. He didn't say a word, but Autumn Star knew instantly that something was wrong. She saw it in the hard set of his jaw, the cold fire in his eyes. He walked past her, took his rifle down from the wall mount, and began to clean it with methodical, deliberate movements. The soft rasp of the cleaning rod sliding down the barrel was the only sound in the room. "What is it?" she finally asked, her voice quiet. Amos looked up from his work, his blue-gray eyes locking with hers. "Cornelius. He's diverted the creek. He's trying to starve us out." He expected to see fear in her eyes. Instead, he saw a reflection of his own steely resolve. She walked to the hearth and picked up the heavy iron poker. "The Dine have fought for their water before," she said, her voice steady and low. "It's the blood of the earth. We do not let it be stolen." In that moment, looking at her standing there so fierce and unafraid, Amos realized the truth. It wasn't just his farm anymore. It wasn't just his fight. The word she had used resonated deep within him. *usk. A man protecting his land was one thing. A man protecting his family was something else entirely. Cornelius had made a grave miscalculation. He thought he was dealing with a broken, lonely man he could easily push aside. He was about to find out he was facing a father, and a confrontation was now terrifyingly inevitable. The morning air was deceptively calm, washed clean and cool after a night of restorative silence. But Amos felt no peace. He moved with a grim purpose, checking the load in his rifle, placing a heavy axe near the front door and a pitchfork just inside the barn. He wasn't a violent man by nature, but he was a territorial one. Cornelius had crossed a line that was older than any property, deed, or lawman's badge. He had threatened his water and, by extension, his son's future. It was just past noon when they appeared, 3 riders silhouetted against the bright sky, kicking up a plume of arrogant dust. Cornelius was in the lead, flanked by 2 hired men whose faces were as hard and unforgiving as the landscape. They rode into the yard and dismounted, their spurs jingling like a death rattle. Cornelius strode toward the cabin, a sneer twisting his lips. "Amos, I've come to solve your little problem for you. The good folks in Redemption are concerned. We can't have a woman and a half-breed brat living out here, unprotected. Me and the boys are taking them to the sheriff. For their own good, you understand." Amos stepped out onto the porch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The transformation in him was profound. The stoop of grief was gone from his shoulders, replaced by an unshakable stillness. He was no longer a man haunted by ghosts. He was a fortress, and he was defending his own. "No," he said. The word was quiet, yet it carried the weight of finality. Cornelius laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Don't be a fool. You can't stop us." He gestured to his men, who began to advance, their hands hovering near the pistols at their hips. "Get the squaw." As the first man reached the bottom step of the porch, a sudden, piercing shriek echoed from the barn loft window. It was a sound halfway between a hawk's cry and a war cry. At the same instant, a heavy sack of feed plummeted from the loft door, exploding on the ground near the men's horses. The animals, already on edge, reared and whinnied in terror, their eyes rolling. Cornelius's horse bolted, galloping madly toward the open field. The 2 hired men scrambled to control their own mounts, their attention completely diverted. It was the only opening Amos needed. He moved with a speed born of pure adrenaline. He didn't grab his rifle. Instead, he lunged off the porch, snatched the pitchfork from just inside the barn, and in 2 powerful strides stood between the henchman and his cabin. He held the tool not like a farmer, but like a soldier held a spear, its sharpened tines glinting in the sun. "Get off my land," Amos commanded, his voice a low growl. One of the men finally calmed his horse, and seeing Amos armed with a farm tool, chuckled and reached for his pistol. "You gonna stop us with that, old man?" Before he could clear the leather, Amos lunged. He didn't aim for the man, but for the ground in front of his horse. The tines bit deep into the earth, and with a powerful heave, Amos ripped a chunk of sod from the ground, flinging it into the horse's face. The animal screamed and bucked violently, throwing its rider hard into the dirt. The man's pistol flew from his hand, landing near the water trough. The second henchman, seeing his partner downed, drew his weapon, but his focus was on Amos. He never saw Autumn Star, who had slipped out the back of the cabin and circled around. She wielded the heavy iron poker from the hearth like a club, and brought it down with all her strength on the man's gun hand. There was a sickening crack of bone and a yell of agony. His pistol clattered to the ground. Now it was just Cornelius standing alone and disarmed, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He looked from his 2 incapacitated men to the determined farmer with the pitchfork, and then to the Navajo woman with the fire poker, her eyes blazing with a protective fire that matched Amos's own. Amos advanced on him, the pitchfork held steady. This is over, Cornelius. You will ride back to your ranch. On your way, you will tear down every rock and log of that dam you built. If my creek is not flowing freely by sunset, I will not come for your water. I will come for you." He pressed the tip of one tine against the soft flesh under Cornelius's chin. "This is my family. This is my home. You are not welcome here. Ever again." Defeated, humiliated, and utterly outmaneuvered, Cornelius paled. He gave a jerky nod, his bravado shattered. He backed away slowly, then turned and ran, chasing after his horse like the coward he was. His men, one nursing a broken hand, the other limping badly, scrambled after him. Amos watched them until they were nothing but a smudge of dust on the horizon. He lowered the pitchfork, his arms trembling from the spent adrenaline. Autumn Star came to stand beside him. They didn't speak, but a profound understanding passed between them. They had faced the storm together and held their ground. By the next evening, the creek was running full and clear again. The threat was gone. A quiet, peaceful evening settled over the farm. As Amos sat on the porch, watching Daniel sleep in his cradle, he felt a contentment he hadn't known was possible. He went inside to find Autumn Star tying a small bundle of her belongings together. A cold dread, sharper than any fear he'd felt facing Cornelius's men, seized him. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice tight. She looked at him, her expression calm but tinged with a deep sadness. "My promise to Spirit Fawn is kept. Daniel is safe. He has his father. My place is not here." The thought of her leaving, of the cabin returning to its hollow silence, was unbearable. He realized in that instant that the void in his life had been filled not just by the unexpected joy of a son, but by her quiet strength, her wisdom, her presence. She had brought life back not only to his house, but to his heart. "Don't go," he said, the words rushing out, raw and honest. He crossed the room and stood before her, taking her hands in his. They were small and warm, and felt impossibly right. I thought my life was over when Lily died. I was just waiting for my time. But you came and you brought him. You brought me back to life, Autumn Star." He looked into her deep, dark eyes. "Your place is here, if you'll have it. Not as a guest, not as a helper, as my wife, as Daniel's mother. Our worlds are different, I know that. But we can build a new one right here, together." Tears welled in her eyes, shimmering in the lamplight. She'd come to deliver a child out of duty, never expecting to find a home. She'd seen the good man beneath the grief, the strong father beneath the loneliness. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, and she smiled. Together, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He gently pulled her into his arms, a gesture that was both a promise and a prayer. He was no longer just Amos, the grieving widower. He was Amos the father, the husband. He looked over her shoulder at the sleeping child in the cradle, his son. The storm had brought them together, and in its wake, under the vast, quiet sky of Arizona, a family had been born. True family isn't always born of blood, but is often forged in the fires of adversity. It teaches us that the deepest love can bloom from the most unexpected seeds, healing old wounds and creating a future we never dared to imagine. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to confirm your subscription and leave a like. It helps us a lot.